Hey there, this is Dan, and you're watching The Salty Sea. I'm here today with an episode that is very near and dear to my heart, at least, because I'm getting into the MathHammer episode. I'm going to go on a full deep dive into all of the MathHammer that I use when I look at my favorite game in the hobby, which is Warcry. And I also just want to talk about, the main point of MathHammer anyway. So the reason this is so special to me is because, you know, it is sort of the nerdiest corner of an already extremely nerdy hobby. Um, but I actually find it, a big part of what I enjoy about the game. Um, I mean, when I say math hammer, like what am I trying to achieve by that, right? Because it can be really simple or really complex. Sometimes you just have, say, two different abilities you're looking at. And this can be in Age of Sigmar or 40K or Warcry or Kill Team or really any strategic game, right? You can just look at two abilities and say, you know, I don't want to feel like a dummy using one when it wouldn't have been as effective as using the other. Let me just like actually calculate out what it looks like when I use the two of them. So, one example is for Scions of the Flame, right? They have their double ability that buffs up their attacks. And then when you math it out, it's not actually doing more damage than Onslaught is, pretty much any of the time, except against Toughness 6, right? So then that's just a really simple example of where just doing some quick calculations can help you kind of figure out just a small little piece of the game that can just be a little bit more effective. Um, Getting sort of more complex into the math hammer of the game is also a thing that can be really enjoyable. But at that point, it's like there's almost this human need to create order from chaos, right? To sort of look at this massive game and try to sort of piece it out into pieces that you can define, that you can make sense of in your own mind. Um, it can make the game less fun for some people, right? I mean, and there's nothing wrong if you're the kind of person who likes to just kind of paint the minis and roll them out there and chuck some dice. The game is really fun that way, and it would be a real shame if someone were to come away from a video like this and think, oh, there's something wrong with how I'm playing the game if I'm not doing this. That's not what I'm saying at all. I just think, you know, games like this, Magic the Gathering is similar. Some people treat D&D this way, where it's a hobby that mixes solitaire with the social. Um, Even anyone who plays sports, it's the same way, where you're working out on your own and then you go out and play the sport. Um, you know, Diving into the math underlying a game can really just be a big part of the solitaire part, right? What for some people is list building could for some other people be math hammering. So I try to approach it with that kind of philosophy, but I do notice that the idea of Math Hammer does still revolt a lot of people. You don't hear this nearly as much, right? But you still do a little bit where people will just kind of yell on the internet, well, Math Hammer never works in a real game. Um, and like I just said, those folks are becoming rarer and rarer. Um, I think sort of the drive of data analytics taking over, you know, sports management, taking over a lot of people's businesses and job, you know, the approach that they do in their work life. I think data is starting to become a bigger part of a lot more people's lives, but it still exists. There's still these people who are very uncomfortable about it. And the funny thing is, usually when they are able to kind of crow to themselves about how Math Hammer doesn't work in real games, it's usually actually just that the person who was doing the math was wrong, or sometimes there was just variance, and they don't know because they're looking at a results-based approach when really a process-based approach is almost always more effective in the long run. So think about something like the percent chance of something. Well, if you know that you're putting something you're putting yourself in a position where you're 80% likely to win a die roll that will eventually win you the game. Um, there's going to be those 1 in 5 games where you lose the die roll and you lose the game, and maybe the other person who didn't do the math will think that they like totally outplayed you and destroyed you in that game because they won. And that's just not true always, and that's going to be true of games like Warhammer, of any kind of variance-based game. And it's honestly, in my opinion, part of what makes the game so good. The other reason I think it can upset some people is if you do like to win, but you're not that into math, it can feel threatening to hear someone say they've solved an in-game question. Um, and especially like for me, seeing that a lot of the time you also do see people say that they've solved something in game when you actually really look into their reasoning, they haven't quite solved it. They've uncovered some sort of essentially important things, but they haven't really solved any corner of it, or maybe even, sometimes you can do um, classic data errors where it's just, you think you've uncovered something, but you have actually uncovered the opposite and you just haven't figured it out yet, right? You haven't controlled for the right things. So that makes me want to get into, what are the actual pitfalls of getting really into MathHammer in this game? The first thing I want to talk about is sort of the way there's a meta to the game, right? Nothing exists in a vacuum. So you can try to, um, put values on what is important in the game mathematically. And if the designers have done a great job, there's going to be some kind of rock, paper, scissor element to the game where um, your values that you've put into your equations are going to exist against one certain meta, but then the game essentially changes as soon as you choose different pieces to play, right? So um, math does have to change over time to sort of describe new ways that people are attacking the list building phase of the game in any kind of really complex game like Warcry or AOS or 40K, anything like that. Another issue that is sort of solvable with math, but is extremely difficult and tricky is expressing geometry via spreadsheet style math. Um, you can get into it. You can sort of value movement a certain amount in your calculations, but um, for the most part, things like how much terrain is going to be on a board. Well, that completely changes how valuable movement is going to be in that particular game, right? So, like in my math calculations, I value flight at a certain amount, but on a completely blank board, well, flight doesn't really help you much at all, right? Because there's no terrain that you need to fly over. I also sort of discount the mount keyword a little bit because you can't climb onto terrain, right? But on a flat board, that doesn't matter. And they actually do sell a Warcry board that isn't flat, but it's essentially, it's just big trees. So the things that are in the way, you can't climb them. So um, sort of expressing which types of terrain boards that you're going to be playing on versus how you're going to value different types of movement is very difficult, and it's a very your mileage may vary type of thing, right? Because um, what's going to be good on one person's board in their basement might be a little different on another person's board. Um, this kind of applies double to movement abilities, right? Because um, you know, the things where you say add to the movement of a few fighters around you, um, or sort of buff a unit's movement in AOS or something, you know, that's going to really depend on, say, the deployments, the actual missions that you're working in, things like that. And so that's where we also kind of get into where you can sort of find yourself building to the math of the game as opposed to the game as it is played itself. So I think a big place where you need to be sensitive of this is if you're going to an event that has a tournament pack for you to look over beforehand, it's really important to do so and to take a look at, what qualities are going to be most valuable in the specific games you're going to be playing, right? Because you can create sort of a general mathematical framework that sort of, in your opinion, solves what you're looking at more generally in the game. But that's not going to be useful if your equations are sort of putting in a whole bunch of variables for things that just aren't going to come up in your games, right? Then you would actually be better off sort of um, shifting how you weight different things. It's also really hard to describe tactics with math. Um, I'll show a little bit in the future. I've worked really hard to try to build tactics into my list rating algorithms as much as possible, but it's still, it's still something you can run into, and it's also impossible to, um, well, not impossible, but it's really difficult to um, describe the way that some players are going to use certain tactics differently than others, right? So there is sort of the classic ELO system that people use for like chess and things like that. I actually think it has some real drawbacks when applied to wargaming. Um, there's a really amazing Warhammer Weekly video that you can watch where they've kind of dove into a lot of this with player skill. Um, I do think there are some endogeneity problems to that kind of data in any kind of game where you bring a list before the game, right? Where both players aren't necessarily starting with um, symmetrical lists, right? So you can't necessarily control for faction and still have controlled for the quality of the list that is showing up. Um, but, all of that is sort of digressing a little bit, right? Because it's more just that even within one game, someone can have a good game or kind of a bad game, or someone can be better at applying certain types of tactics versus other types of tactics. And it's very difficult to kind of build that into any kind of rating system that you're going to put together yourself. Certainly there are people who have sort of put more energy into attacking that than I have, but it's a serious problem no matter what your approach is. So what do we actually get done then when we sort of put our calculators into the game? Um, on sort of a more esoteric level, right? MathHammer sort of drills down from the nebulous chaos of the game as it's presented to you to kind of a much smaller set of essential questions and testing points that you can attack, right? You can figure out exactly what you know, what is clear, and then what you don't know, and then that can really drive what you want to test and what you want to put down on the board to gain greater understanding of. In a well-designed game, right, any good research should raise more questions than it answers. This is sort of a classic thing in academia, right? There's actually very few fields that are sort of finite, right? Like say trigonometry, for example, is a branch of math that, it's also a science that we literally know everything there is to know about trigonometry. Um, that is extremely rare, right? So most of the time in most fields, um, and this is going to be true in any really deep, well-designed game, sort of researching more into the game is going to give you it's just as many questions as it does answers. So one of the questions I've been most interested in lately is um, trying to think of the best way to sort of solve list building in Warcry. And I kind of wonder if it's more tempting to do with this game, almost because the game is smaller, right? So there's a really interesting Age of Sigmar tool called ListBot that's out there that sort of tries to rate your Age of Sigmar list, and the um, the guy running it, he talks a little bit about how he's got his rating system in the list bot, but then it can often be pretty wildly different than what's succeeding in tournaments, and it can be really hard to figure it out exactly. And so part of that is because there's just so much going on in that game in Age of Sigmar that isn't tied to unit stats, and the abilities that are available to you are just so much more sort of nebulous and applying to different circumstances than they are in Warcry, where it's actually pretty sort of set in stone how the abilities in Warcry sort of align to a really rigid framework that you can attack. So that's a big advantage of Warcry, making it more almost more um, tempting to try to solve than sort of the bigger games are because it's both small and really deep. So you can try to handle the whole system at once in one set of numbers, and yet still never feel like you've totally gotten there. So now I'm going to get into the specifics, right? So I built a rating system first for units and then building up into lists. Um, so units, I think the quality of a unit is sort of made up of its ability to do damage, its ability to tank incoming damage, and its ability to project its power around the board, whether it be by just going somewhere or by shooting to that place. Um, then the quality of a list is built up from its units, its abilities, and its mechanics. So I'll start with sort of talking about how I've rated um, units. So the first thing and the most important is damage efficiency. And this also gets to be one of the simpler ones. Um, so I add up DPA 3 and DPA 4, which is just damage per activation, and then it's versus toughness 3 and toughness 4. And then I add half of DPA 5. Um, this is because toughness 5 is just so much rarer than 4 and 3, which are, I think, roughly equally aligned in the game. So it's weighted as about being half as important. Toughnesses 2 and 6 are just so rare that I just don't even put them in the calculations because I don't think you really need to. Then I just multiply it all by 75 and divide by points. Multiplying by 75, there's nothing special about 75 as a number. It's just what you do to get a number that mostly lands between 1 and 10, right? So that makes it just a really clear rating system that I can just show anyone and be like, well, this is a 7.3 out of 10 um, in terms of its damage efficiency. And this one is a 1.4, so it's nothing. Um, that just makes it really simple. Then getting on to tank rating, and this one is much more of a wall of math because I use ATAN on toughness minus 3.9, and then I add 2.5 to it, um, and then I multiply it by some constants, and then multiplying by hit points. So toughness is essentially a multiplier on your hit points, right? So the idea is toughness makes it so that people do less damage to you per dice roll, and then your hit points is how much damage you take, right? So um, that part is a pretty clear interaction. The thing that's less clear is exactly how valuable toughness is, right? Because not every toughness jump is equally valuable. The jump from 3 to 4 is actually really good in game. Um, and I think is actually undervalued a little bit. I'll talk more about that in a second. But all the other jumps, right? The jump from 2 to 3 doesn't really do much. The jump from 4 to 5 does a little bit, but still not nearly as much as 3 to 4. Um, and the jump from 5 to 6 is almost always useless. And so using the ATAN function, you can see here on this graph, it really does help and have sort of the biggest jump be between 3 and 4. I might tweak this a little bit in the future to make this a little flatter, but in general, I'm just really happy with how this function manages to sort of weight the different increases in toughness. Um, Now, toughness in general, as a stat. It's the most overrated stat in GW's sort of pointing algorithm. Um, a lot of hay has been made by a lot of folks, not just me in the community, regarding GW's overvaluing of toughness. But I do want to just point out that it's at this point, it is so overrated that people sometimes just dismiss it out of hand as being useful at all, when it does still have its uses, especially the jump from 3 to 4 in certain missions, like any of the hunter-killer missions. It does actually help often to have something that is toughness 4 because um, the speed at which, um, the most competitive units can kill you is really different for a toughness 3 model versus a toughness 4 one. Any of the others, it's not. Um, and it's still, they still tend to pay too much for it in points usually. It just does have a use in the game. Um, So you'll find, if you were to see my ratings for almost everything, things with higher toughnesses do tend to have higher tank ratings, not always, than things with lower toughnesses. They just end up having much lower overall ratings in general. But it's not like tankiness is never useful. Um, Even though, yes, having high HP is weighted much higher in this than having high toughness is. That's what this sort of plus zero point 0.9 times H is, just the hit point stat. Um, that's what that weighting does for you. So then going into projection, here I subtract some from movement and then subtract some from range and then raise them each um, to a certain uh, exponent that is less than 1. And so what that does is this heavily punishes um, any anything that is the minimum. So this heavily punishes movement 3 and heavily punishes range 1 in terms of how much value it's adding to your projection. But then it also starts to discount um, each individual range on the margin adds less to your rating than the one before. So the jump from range 1 to 2 adds more for you than the jump from range 2 to 3, which then adds more than the jump from range 3 to 4, etc. And then the fact that I'm having a higher exponent for movement, right, 0.85, versus what I've got for range is 0.55, just is an expression of the fact that movement doesn't drop off as much as it gets higher as range does, right? So if you have movement 10 versus movement 5, movement 10 is not twice as good as movement 5, but it is a lot closer to being twice as good, right? Because actually going to the place or having the extra movement to go around obstacles is really important. Where range, the longer your range, at some point there's going to be a piece of terrain there, and then that just blocks you off you know, from any of your surplus range mattering, right? So um, range 20 isn't anywhere nearly as good or as good as being twice as good as range 10, for example. So that's why the exponent is so much smaller there. This does this way of defining projection does slightly overvalue mobile archers. So things like skyfires, wind chargers, um, night venators, things like that are just ever so slightly overvalued because they're getting the low points in both movement and in range, right? Those really valuable to the rating system points, which are the second, third, and fourth inch of range, and then the um, fourth, fifth, and sixth inches of movement, which are just giving you the most rating points. So the mobile archers are giving you both, but it's the amount that it overvalues them is very small, um, and I think it does a really good job at any kind of melee troop, any type at all, and then any sort of archer that's not very fast. So then I have a few modifiers that I get into where they're just to account for attributes that aren't in the formulas. So one is DPA3 being over a certain threshold. So if you've watched my sort of evaluation videos in the past, my guides in the past, you'll know that I really value being able to kill chaff in one hit. So anything with DPA3 being greater than 8 or DPA3 being greater than 10, those are both important, so I add a little modifier to them um, to help just boost those units. Also, the mount keyword is just a constant drain where it's just you just can't climb on terrain. So that's just really um, really gutting for certain missions and also really gutting for certain boards that you can play on. So I just subtract a constant 1 from those units. Flying, however, I do 0.05 times the movement stat. That's because flying is actually more valuable on units with really high movement than it is on units with low movement. Just because the further you're going, the more likely you are to run into terrain, the more likely being able to fly over that terrain is useful. Um, so that's just what that is, right? So there's sort of this classic issue of Night Haunt where they pay for the fly keyword in their points, but they don't actually get to take advantage of it that much because they don't have the really high movement that everything else with flying has, and so that's an issue for them, and part of why that they kind of struggle for most people who I've talked to who play them. So when I put them all together, I just add damage efficiency, tankiness, projection, and the modifiers. And I rate damage efficiency a little bit higher. So I multiply it by 1.2 just because it is the most important thing is how much damage you do for your points. So I just weight it a little bit higher than the others. Um, it won't be a surprise to anyone, I think, that giant rats come out number one, aether wings come out number two, and the serpent from Splintered Fang comes out number three. And the difference between the serpent and the number four unit is pretty high. And then there's, I think, 4 or 5 fighters that are all kind of squished together at that 4, 5, 6 spot. Um, so that's the unit math hammer. So then I get into putting it all together into lists, right? So um, I have sort of fighty points, quote unquote, which is really just the weighted addition of all of the, um, all of the unit stats all together. And then I balance them with Trixie points, which is a two-part thing of just abilities and how well you play to the game mechanics. So for abilities, first I look at quads. Now, the reason I break this up into quads, doubles, triples um, is because the dice mechanic is very rigid in terms of you roll what you roll, you have certain possibilities of rolling those things, and your ability to get value out of different rolls is just really important. So quads, you get 1 point if you have a good rampage target. This is because rampage is by far the most important quad. It's very rare, the warbands that have something better than it. Um, and then so you get 1 point for having a good target, an extra half a point for either having an elite rampage target, like something um, really good at it, like a Doom Bull or um, the the Zangor on disc, who hits things, the Enlightened Aviarch, something like that, or for having two good ones, like when Corvus Cabal has the two Shrike Talons that are really good. You also get uh, um, half a point for something that's better than Rampage, or just a 1 point bonus for something that is an alternative to Rampage. So the max you can get out of that is 2 points, but there's a few different ways you can put those 2 points together. Then doubles, it's the same. You get 1 point for a good onslaught target, or something that you would be happy to use instead of onslaught. And then you also get a point for having a complementary double that is sort of something that you'd use in a totally different circumstance. Then you get, for triples, 1 point for a good triple, half a point for a second complementary good triple, or a full point if the first triple is amazing. This does end up costing some warbands that have 3 different triples, but I kind of like that because triples, you're not really going to use 2 in a given round. So it's much better to just focus on having one good one. Having 2 can be good if it's like they're used in very different situations. Then you get a lot of utility from that. But otherwise, it's much better to just have one really amazing triple in your warband. Then finally, there's the extra points where basically the real sort of beef to the ability mechanic in Warcry is if you manage to roll 2 doubles when you're rolling at the start of a round, and you have wild dice where you get to then choose if you want a full house or 3 doubles. That's sort of the best roll you can get that's sort of common to do. There's a bunch of different ways to put yourself in a position where, like, there's a bunch of different roles that you can have to put yourself in a position to either have a full house or 3 triples. And I think that a lot of the time that's actually more powerful than having a quad. So I give certain amount of points available if, depending on whether that type of roll is super effective for you or if you get some kind of combo going. So let's say like Iron Jaws, um, just being able to have that incredible movement on just a double instead of a triple, and then being able to then have two doubles available for pumping up damage is really powerful, right? So they get a bunch of points here. Um, so the total is 8 points, and you get an 18% weight for that in the total of your list. I have put under here what it used to be. So this is what I used for the budget tier list. Very similar, slightly different, and I'll show at the end here how things changed when I changed this up. I also look at the game mechanics. So um, first, you get points for basically in number one here, you get points if you have a big warband, right? But it stops at 13 instead of 15 just because at that point, the more you have, the less each additional one really helps you. Then you get points if you have really high damage fighters. You have points if you have a few tanky fighters, and then you have points for high projection fighters. This is because it really does help in this game to have units that can fill multiple roles, right? So there's so many missions where you have to kill one specific unit, but you do actually get a lot of control over, what your opponent is looking to kill. And so it's really helpful to have, say, something really tanky or something really good at projecting to get over there. Um, you know, List building, when you actually get into the game and are playing with the game mechanics, it's so much more complicated than actually just going, I'm just going to take the thing that has the most damage, I'm just going to spam that as much as I can. Um, my rating system does give you a ton of points for doing that, right? Because like having a ton of fighters is really good. Having half of your warband dedicated to high damage things gives you a lot of points here. Um, but I do just have these because it is important to have different roles shown. Then I actually value being able to survive the deployment mechanic really highly. Deployment in above ground games is really wonky, and it actually gets even crazier in catacombs where everybody's split um, up, sometimes really extremely. So I like to have sort of extra points for lists that are sort of resilient to sort of variance in how they get deployed, um, because I think that's really important. So Rito has a really useful video about, which pieces of your warband are most likely to come on first, which ones are most likely to actually, if you're not careful, be completely irrelevant in the battle. So you get things like points if you're able to make sure that your other deployment groups are still going to be relevant. Or when I show here exploitative of deployment mechanic, I'm looking at a lot of lists where they make it so their shield is just able to do something really insane in terms of an ability combo or something, and then they can actually just exploit the fact that you can have over half the points in your warband in one deployment group. That, at least in above ground games, you can really rely on the fact that it's going to be kind of in the thick of things. You also just get a couple bonus points for having a fighter that can one-shot KO a chaff unit, or for having something that can two-shot kill something at range. So this used to just have a lot less granularity and be 7 points. Now I've got it at 13 points, and that's what I'll be doing the competitive tier list at. But you can see, the budget tier list doesn't really change much from how I did it. Um, the only changes was that Slaves to Darkness did fall down a little bit. They have multiple triples. They also don't have some of the sort of unit roles that I think are important. And Flesh Eater Courts and Ideneth Deepkin, their budget lists, really jumped up to the point that they're actually just barely, I think, like a quarter point behind Skaven, and like within a couple tenths of a point away from each other. This S tier actually sort of compresses to be like they're all essentially the same on a budget. Um, so getting the cheapest version of any of these three warbands is just really incredible and quite a bit more bang for your buck than anything else. But then the dip between Idoneth Deepkin and Slaves to Darkness here does end up being big, but um, the dip between Slanesh Demons and the next warband is even bigger. So that's why, A tier is still here and so small. So the order really doesn't change too much, but just ever so slightly it does. Let me show you a quick example of what it looks like, for example, in my spread. All right, so here we are. We've just got some mid-tier warbands, right? So we've got the kind of added together unit score of the things that are in Nurgle Rotbringers, and for the most part, these scores are pretty low, right? However, then, I'm playing around here with different lists, one of which allies in the Enlightened Aviarch on disc, which 20 is really high. So Enlightened Aviarch on disc is a leader option who can ally in, who solves a lot of the issues, and so, or a lot of the issues specifically that Nurgle has. Not most other factions don't need it nearly as badly, and so then we have kind of the weighted score, which is basically I multiply sort of the fighty score by the amount of points it has, and then I add all these together and I divide by 1,000. This way, any list that has a lot of points left over between this and 1,000, the dead weight does bring it down for the weighted score. Then I just have the ability score here, the roll score, and then, here's the weighting where, um, you know, one is worth a certain amount, one is worth a different amount, etc. Um, and then that gets us to our sort of total scores. And so you can see here that um, putting in the Enlightened Aviarch does, the rating system agrees that it solves some of the problems, but even with it, Nurgle Rotbringers goes from, this 57 rating score to, which is totally in the basement, to 65 still not being particularly high, right? You can see Nurgle Demons still scoring significantly higher than that. And even if we go down to Slanesh Mortals, well, here they're allying in a Contorted Epitome, but they're generally going higher than that. The Contorted Epitome is really interesting here, right? Because it doesn't actually score that high in terms of just its stats. Fiend Bloods score much higher than it, but including it in your list makes your ability score be a 7.5 out of 8 here, which is really high, which then helps your final score quite a bit. So it makes it so that even though it's much lower in terms of its fightiness score than everything else, right? This list that's allying it in still ends up scoring much higher in the rating system. So that's what I've been working on lately, and I'll be showing sort of the competitive tier list there pretty soon in the next couple weeks. All right, so if you're still with me, thank you so much. Please do consider smashing that like button, as so many people like to say, right? It's our sacrifice to the algorithm gods of YouTube. But that was quite quite a, granular look at sort of math hammering Warcry, which is, my favorite game in the hobby. So if you're still with me, thank you so much for being here, and I'll be coming back with some slightly more accessible Warcry videos in the future, in the next few weeks. So thanks a bunch, and until that happens, may all your rolls be crits.